You know, every once in a while, a movie comes along, a suggestion, an article, a headline that really gets your interest peaked, really makes you look at this story and go, you know what? I want to see this movie. I want to see how this thing plays out. And for me, interestingly enough, it was Freddy versus Jason versus Ash, which is something that was originally pitched in 2004 following the August 15th, 2003 release of Freddy versus Jason, which, as a fun little side note, Freddy versus Jason was the second movie in 2003 to be number one at the box office 2 weeks in a row. No other movie that year was able to pull it off other than Finding Nemo, not Pirates of the Caribbean, not Terminator 3, not both Matrix sequels, and whatever the hell else came out in 2003 was able to have reign in the box office for 2 weeks, with the exception of Nemo and Freddy versus Jason. The film that had a $30 million budget pulled in $114 million worldwide. It was a movie that, for all intents and purposes, should have had a sequel, and it never really materialized. Even though producer Jeff Katz had suggested and really tried to make it happen, Freddy versus Jason versus Ash, which is something he came up with and was pushing out there in 2004. The movie never happened. It was a couple years later a 6-issue miniseries that came out in comic book form that told the story they were going to tell for the movie, which was a lot of fun to read. But the film itself just could never get off the ground. And that is not uncommon for Hollywood. But the question then becomes, WTF happened? What the hell happened with this movie? Why is it that after the success of Freddy vs. Jason, having these horror movies, these horror icons come together in order to battle it out on the big screen before cinematic universes were a thing? We're talking about 5 years before Iron Man was in the MCU was even remotely talked about. Why didn't this happen? Well, there's a number of reasons, and the biggest one, from what I can tell, has a lot to do with the fact that the studio just could not make the deal work. New Line was on board. They were more than happy to talk about it. Jeff Katz, who grew up in the same town in Michigan as Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell, in an interview claimed he knew these guys. He lived next to Raimi's family. He got them on board, and they were both excited and both willing to do it. Then it just kind of happened to fizzle apart. It just kind of happened to go away. And I can't, for the life of me, find exactly what made it fall apart. But it does, well, if you talk to Bruce Campbell, he has a different thing about it. He actually said in a Reddit AMA not too long ago, he says, "I'll be honest with you, I'm not real interested in crossovers. One of the main reasons why Ash versus Jason versus Freddy did not come to pass was because we couldn't control any other character other than Ash. That felt like a creatively bankrupt way to go. Not to mention, you're splitting the proceeds 3 ways with partners you might not want." Now, that gives us a little bit of insight into the overall situation. It gives us a little bit of insight into maybe Bruce Campbell's part of it. And one of the reasons why I've wanted to do this video, and it's been on my mind for the past 7 years, was because in June 2012, I was at a Scriptwriters Network meeting in Universal Studios in Hollywood when Jeff Katz was there, and the subject of Freddy versus Jason versus Ash came up. And Jeff Katz let it slip. Well, I'm paraphrasing here, why the movie ended up failing, why the movie ended up falling apart. And it predominantly had everything to do with Bruce Campbell. If I recall correctly, the words that Jeff Katz used to describe Bruce Campbell in regards to this situation is that he was a, quote, miserable bastard, end quote. Those are the words he used at the Scriptwriters Network back in June of 2012. And it always was peculiar to me, because every interaction I've ever had with Bruce Campbell, which has been a couple, has always been very pleasant, very, very kind. And then the more you start to kind of think about this property in regards to Ash versus, the character of Ash Williams and the character of Freddy and Jason and the rights and trying to get it all together, you can kind of see where there was a bit of a problem here. You can see ultimately where everything pretty much started to fall apart. And if you just look at it now, with the rights in regards to Friday the 13th. They're up in the air, legally speaking. And even though he was rebooted in 2009 and Freddy was rebooted in 2010, both those movies were basic critical and financial failures, even though their original pairing years earlier had grossed a lot of money. And so, New Line hasn't really been about trying to get those characters off the ground once again, because to them, it's just not a worthwhile endeavor. But to a lot of horror fans out there, Freddy versus Jason versus Ash is that team up that got away. Because interestingly enough, Jeff Katz actually had the letter that he sent to the higher ups over at Warner's or at New Line, and he pitched the concept. And what was really fascinating about it, what was really, really fascinating about this whole thing that he broke down was the fact that he explained outright how this movie would make money. And a lot of it had to do with merchandise. Now, we all know when it comes to talking about these movies, these new movies, these new shows, like Star Trek Discovery, it's not selling as much merch, and that's a problem. Look at Star Wars. The new Star Wars movies have not been moving as much merchandise, and that's been a point of contention for Disney, who makes a lot of money off of that merchandise. So in regards to this original letter that he put out there, this is what he actually had said. He says here, the Ash character has, since the release of Army of Darkness in 1993, spawned 3 video games, countless action figures, books, shirts, and more. In fact, Ash has been far more popular than Freddy and Jason in action figure form. All 3 were released as Todd McFarlane's Movie Maniac series, and I actually have both of them from The Evil Dead, or from Army of Darkness, and still in their original container, with several variations now available. Horror fans have been clamoring to see the character on screen for over a decade, the exact same hunger that paid off for us bringing Freddy back to the screen in FVJ. The sheer number of Evil Dead DVD re-releases seem to indicate that the cult following for these films has nothing but grown. Add in the strong initial per-screen showings for Bruce's Bubba Hotep, which was released with almost zero marketing budget and sold solely on Bruce's involvement, and you've got the makings for a genuine cottage industry. Going on to say, having considered Michael Myers, who flat out doesn't fit in the Freddy and Jason worlds, and would require some sort of deal with Dimension and all of the rest of the bigger horror villains, Pinhead, Leprechaun, Chucky, the Tall Man, we maintain that Ash works best as an option for us on several different levels. The cardinal reason is to go this direction is that Ash gives Freddy and Jason a hero to fight that the fans, for the first time, truly care about. Adding another major villain character only hamstrings us and forces us to resort to typical teens beat the bad guy we used in the ending of FEJ. By adding the undisputed biggest hero of the genre to the mix, we open the door to all sorts of combat possibilities, and it's the combat that's going to keep fans coming back. He fits the tone, a mix of horror and comedy for the first Freddy and Jason almost perfectly, which should allow us almost seamless transition into the sequel. And you know what? Jeff is right. Jeff is absolutely right. The question of Ash being an obscure character has come up before in previous interviews, but Jeff did explain it very well here in this previously unreleased memo as of a couple of years ago. And it's true. Ash Williams sells toys. Ash Williams sells merch. Merch is big in the horror market. Merch is big in that world. And if they were looking to capitalize on it as a way to make a lot of money on the side, and then maybe make up for any shortcomings the movie might have had theatrically, this would have been it. And I believe, as much now as I did back in 2004 when I first heard of this particular property, it would have been an absolute success. It would have teamed up the horror movie world in a way that Marvel has turned into an over $20 billion industry. And it would have done it first, and it would have done it, I don't know if I would have said right, but it definitely would have done it first. And what's really funny to me is that Robet Englund was actually 100% on board with this. Recently, at Emerald City Expo in Seattle, he was asked about it at a Q&A, and this is what he had to say. He says, "I'm very disappointed. We left some money on the table, as they say in Hollywood, right after the great success of Freddy vs. Jason. Sam Raimi was the king of the world. He had all the money in the world because of Spider-Man. I'm a huge fan of Sam's, and I'm a big fan of Bruce Campbell. They had this idea, Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash. Now we're in what we call post-Deadpool, post-Guardians of the Galaxy perception. But back then, we hadn't had any kind of film yet, with the exception of Evil Dead and Freddy vs. Jason, that were really mashing graphic novel, comedy, horror, and science fiction, so I love this idea. Sam Raimi wanted Ash to win. He wanted him to win the match, which I thought was a great idea. New Line Cinema was against it because I had just had my ass kicked by Jason. They were afraid because I was the most successful of the 3 franchises. They were afraid. We can't have Freddy killed twice in a row. And I was like, wait a minute, guys. You revived me. You resurrected me with dog urine. It's really easy to bring Freddy back. Come on. It's not that hard to do. But anyway, I loved this idea. I had this vision of a poster of Bruce Campbell with his shirt open and all of his abs spray painted and highlighted, with Freddy Kreuger under one arm and Jason under the other arm. And the poster would say, Freddy versus Jason versus Ash, keeping the world safe from sequels. And when you have Robert Englund on board saying, this was a good idea for Freddy to die, this would have been a permanent thing too. This was going to be a permanent thing. Freddy would have died as a result of this. And I think he would have been okay with that because he didn't come back to the role afterward. That was his last movie anyway. So the real question then becomes, well, how did the comic book do? Because you figure if the comic book would have done well, then they would have maybe perhaps looked at it as adapting it into being the feature. Unfortunately, I don't know those numbers yet, but a sequel did come out a couple years later that was a direct sequel to Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, which basically had Ash team up with the survivors of the people who had been killed by Freddy, killed by Jason, who were then resurrected by the Necronomicon, and they all would have teamed up together in order to fight these guys for the final time. And I think that is pretty damn cool. I do. I think that's pretty damn interesting that you have a situation where you've got these horror survivors teaming up as a kind of an all-star team to take on the bad guys. And the cool thing is this: there were constant references between the 3 films going back as far as the Evil Dead, in which case, or I think it was Evil Dead 2, when Ash had Freddy Krueger's gloves on the wall in the cabin. In one of the Nightmare on Elm Streets, I think the first one, Nancy was watching Evil Dead. In one of the Jason Voorhees movies, you had the Necronomicon on a mantle above a fireplace. The universes were always interconnected. The universes were always ripe for the picking, and that was one of the things that Jeff Katz picked up on, and I think he was absolutely bloody right to do so. Unfortunately, it does kind of appear that there was some problems, and I think in the subsequent decade plus since everything really fell apart, that there's literally no way something like this would ever truly come to fruition once again. My suggestion would ultimately be, why not do it as an animated feature? Why not do it like that? Treat it like that, put them out as an animated feature, and I think you might be able to revive it. Horror movies have very dedicated fan bases, and the fan bases for Evil Dead and Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street are exceptionally loyal, and what I think die trying to get their hands on something like this. But anyway, I just wanted to recount the tale of Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash. What happened, at least from my perspective, and I want to hear your thoughts. Is this something you would have liked to have seen? Have you read the graphic novel or the comic book, and what are your thoughts on it? I'll talk to you guys later. Have yourself a great day. My name is Matt Jarbo. This has been $3 Theater, and peace out.